So the first question is, where can you get the book? Online, I guess. But so her first.
Yes, I think the most pertinent part of the question was the Copenhagen dialogue later on this year in December. What do you think, from what you've seen, the people that you've talked to in policy circles, what do you think China wants to get out of this discussion? Because there seems to be a kind of a gulf of expectations between the developed and the developing countries. China has already made some steps, as we talked about the carbon intensity program, but there's a long way to go.
Right. Well, I think, China's situation is so different than, let's say, the United States. I mean, as we all know, very vibrant, growing economy, rising incomes, but also many hundreds of millions of people who are not part of that economy, who it's central to bring them into that economy. And so economic growth and development is a central preoccupation. Job employment creation is a central preoccupation in China. But as I think you know, that maybe starting around 2003 or so, the pollution issues became much more of a central question of how to deal with it. And so my perception, and I would defer to you and to others from China here, is that responding to climate change blends in with responding to pollution problems, the air in cities and cleaning them up. And I'm struck that China has put energy efficiency at the top of actually its agenda, although it's hard to do in a growing economy. And so it regards responding to climate as also to respond to the pollution issues. I think the Chinese have made clear that they don't want to have binding agreements, but that we've certainly, I think since about 2005, seen a lot of evolution in their point of view, as we've seen in a lot of other governments.
Okay, let's just go for one more question, and then I think we'll have to wrap things up, but continue this discussion after the plenary is over.
But thank you for looking for the book. So.
Okay, why don't we take this gentleman in the blue shirt in the 4th row? Yes.
Do you want to ask the person in the front row too?
My name is Sergio Capusta with Shell in the Netherlands.
The person in the front row is asking.
Sergio Capusta with Shell in the Netherlands. You mentioned, and I understand, that there is no one single bullet or silver bullet from the technology side. You also mentioned the importance of regulations and policy in order to solve energy and environment. Many questions about policy. I want to just narrow it to one of two choices. We've been talking about carbon tax or cap and trade scheme. Which one do you think will be most likely to lead to quicker, faster, and longer term resolution about energy and carbon control? Thank you.
That's the question is about carbon tax versus cap and trade, and something I've been looking at a lot about where the whole idea of cap and trade and kind of putting a price on pollution. Each of them, there's not one more perfect than the other. The carbon tax gives a kind of predictability in the price. Cap and trade gives a predictability in terms of the volume of CO2 and that it squeezes it down. A cap and trade is a complicated system. I think the general, since Kyoto, it has been the preferred solution. And I think at least in a lot of societies, including my own, the notion of imposing something called a carbon tax is just politically something that's very difficult. So a part of it, I think, has to do with what's politically achievable. I think we have heard recently some arguments, we heard it the other night, as to why a carbon tax is much simpler. So I think this is kind of a thing that will be kind of fought out. I do think that my own guess is that kind of coming out of Copenhagen, because as we've established, it's not going to be a treaty, it's going to be a process, we'll see more focus on standards, mandates, and so forth. The U.S. now is looking at a national renewable standard for all of its electricity. So I think that people will turn to those kind of non-market solutions. There are costs too, but the cost is not as obvious as something, an explicit tax is the most obvious, a cap and trade is next obvious. Mandates are less obvious, but they too are paid for by consumers. The point is there is a price, and it goes back to the question I think way over there and the other questions. Also, what's going to stimulate, what's going to give the signal to innovation in a predictable way? There's not a perfect answer, but it's a very interesting debate.
Dan, we're going to have to wrap it up there, but just before we finish, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with the audience today?
Well, I think this kind of dialogue that's reflected in Singapore International Energy Week is very important, not only to this region, but globally. And so I think establishing that, because it is a constant process of learning for all of us, and just the kind of dialogue that we have here today is very useful. So I'm very pleased to be part of this, and again, thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you all today.
And thank you everyone for joining in. My apologies if you didn't get your question into Dan, but he is sticking around.
Right.
So you'll get the chance to follow up with him later on. But Dan, thank you very much for that once again. And thank you all for joining us here today, and have a fruitful week at the SIEW. And we wish you well. Thanks a lot, everyone.